Evan, aka Gospel Gambit, and I'm welcoming you guys in for a special video today. We're going to be going over my first over-the-board game in close to 2 years. I had the honor of playing with the Knights of South Florida. It's a chess group in Delray, Florida, and they do a Wednesday night meetup where they run rated USCF games, 60 minutes with a delay of 5 seconds. Little backstory before jumping into the game. This is my first time going there. Was able to meet a bunch of individuals that hopefully I'll be able to play in the future, and hopefully more game reviews will come from those games. As we were waiting for pairings to arrive, I had the pleasure of talking with a woman named Nurieka. Got to learn a little bit more about her, and as we started to go look at our pairings, we saw that we are paired up for our first match. So without further ado, we're going to take a dive into a advanced variation of the Caro-Kann today, and let's dive right into it. Alright, so my opponent started with 1e4, and of course we play 1c6, our Caro-Kann defense. Our opponent followed up with the d4, and we play d5. After our opponent plays e5 here, we go into the advanced version of the Caro-Kann. At this point, I play c5. There's obviously c5 or bishop to f5. Both have their pluses and minuses. The trendy move is c5 at the moment. My opponent played knight to f3, which is a normal continuation move. And here we take the pawn and play knight to c6. Now, in I would say most games, White decides to take the knight here on c6. We can pull up the database. About 35% of games go that way, or they decide to pin the knight to our king here, and if we're not too careful, we can fall into the classic trap of a fork of a bishop hitting our king and our rook. So I was a little thrown off here at the bishop to f4 move. This was the first move where I kind of had a bit of a think. Reminding you guys, this was a 60-minute game with 5-second delay. I think I took about 4 or 5 minutes here. I ended up playing knight takes knight. Looking back on it, which is a totally fine move, I believe that I would have rather have played queen to b6 here, putting some pressure on black's white knight here in the center, probably forcing the trade on c6, and putting a lot of pressure down the b2, the b file. Variation that the computer has is queen to b6, take, we take back with our pawn, knight to d2, and we can take the pawn here. And after rook b1, the evaluation is even. White has had the opportunity to develop 3 of their pieces. Our queen's going to get chased around for a little bit. If we try taking the pawn here, then White's going to try to open up the center quickly, and all of a sudden all of White's pieces are going to be flooding the board, and we're going to be under a lot of pressure. Like I said, it is playable, totally playable variation, but you got to be careful as a black player here. I did not go into that line. In the future though, I think I will play queen to b6. Instead, I took on d4. White takes back with the queen, and e6, kind of just firming up our pawn chain here in the middle. At this point, White did end up playing one of the top moves. I was kind of looking at moves such as bishop to b5, where after blocking, White has the opportunity here to force me to go uncastled, which, you know, if that happened, it happened. At this point, with queens off the board, our dark squared bishop is going to be very active. Our pawn chain is going to be pretty secure here. So I was fine kind of going into this variation. So I was kind of happy to see bishop to d3. Keeps more pieces on the board, and I thought I'd have opportunities in the future to capitalize on this. I ended up playing knight to e7 here, trying to get my knight over to either c6 or g6, putting pressure on this central pawn, as I have thoughts of possibly winning this central pawn at some point in the game. or even undermining that pawn with moves like f6 in the future, when our bishops may be on e7, and we'd have a nice strong bishop on this diagonal. Again, if white wants to go for this pin, now my knight can jump into c6, and it keeps a few more pieces on the board, or I at least don't have to sacrifice my light square bishop. White continues with castling, get their king to safety, and at this point I play knight to c6, hitting white's queen here, gaining a tempo, and hopefully being able to play bishop e7, castling on my next few moves. Now, white ended up playing queen to a4 here. I thought this was not a major mistake, but the first time where I was going to start getting a slight advantage. It allows for my natural development of this light squared bishop and for discovery possibilities with my knight in the future. So with the move bishop to d7, I thought white might have to move their queen again, or risk losing a pawn in the center, or possibly have other tactical ideas with this bishop eyeing white's queen. Now white decided to strike in the center, and as you can see, the computer's not a big fan of this move. It does allow for us to pick up a pawn. Again, this pin, or not pin, but this discovered attack is a pretty strong move here against white. So we end up taking the pawn. White does have to drop their queen back or risk losing it. And at this point, we are able to win the light squared bishop. So by taking on c4, we have a fork against white's pieces. If they try to save the queen, then we win a piece. So white is forced to trade pieces here on c4. Now at this point, I know I'm up a pawn. We have the bishop pair. We should be in a good position moving forward, but remember, white's king is already castled. They're nice and safe. I have to be careful here with rooks coming along the d file. White's going to be able to develop their knight to c3, and we could see multiple knights taking the open files before I can even finish my development myself. So we're not out of the woods just yet here, and we continue with queen to f6, the top engine move. My idea was we want to be able to slide our queen or our rook over to d8 if need be. We don't want to be in a pin from white's rook here after they try to take over the d file. It allows for pressure on the b2 pawn. If white's not too careful, they could be dropping another pawn and go from there. We also have ideas now of hitting white's queen and trying to win this bishop that's on f4. Right now, the only defender is white's queen. So it's a piece that if we can remove the queen here, which obviously white's not going to want to trade their queen away unless it's for our queen, then we might be able to pick up a piece. Now at this point, I had to do a little calculation. White plays the natural developing move, knight to f3. And I wasn't 100% sure about, there's a few different lines here that I was calculating. I ended up playing bishop to e7, getting ready to castle. I didn't know if this was a good move here at the time. Rook to c8. I thought white had this queen to e4, and then after bishop to c6, white can trade queens off here on e5. The computer gives almost a -2 to -2.5 advantage here. We're technically only up a pawn, and it's still a tough position in my eyes to move forward in. I'd much prefer the queens to be on the board for attacking opportunities. You know, I know we were going to play f6, maybe tuck our queen or our king into f7, develop our pieces to the board, but I just did not feel confident with us getting the queens off the board that I could convert that position into a winning position. So I ended up, instead of playing rook to c8, go for this bishop to e7 move. White drops their bishop back, defending it with the f2 pawn and allowing their queen to start getting active. Black's bishop is also targeting the a7 pawn here, so if we ever do decide to move this rook, we have to be careful not to drop our pawn here on a7. White's structure is still very solid, and I thought at this opportunity, why not castle? Allows us to get our king to safety. Our rooks are connected along the 8th rank here, and we can start trying to contest white for these open files. White ends up playing queen to c7, and at the time I did not totally understand the reason of this move. It looks like white's queen could possibly get trapped, but white did have a kind of a tricky maneuver here. Their idea is to come queen to c7 and queen to g3, making sure that the queen is on the king side, able to defend these pawns, as a lot of my ideas are going to be setting up our bishops and firing along those diagonals towards white's king. So I play bishop to c7, very natural, defends this pawn on b7. We're now staring at the g2 pawn, which is a lot weaker now that white does not have their light squared bishop, and white brings their queen over to g3. At this point in the game, I was feeling, I'd say, slightly optimistic. The bishop pair, like I said, and we're up a pawn, but there's not really a clear attack on white's king in my eyes. I thought that we were going to be contesting each other along the d-file, maybe trading off all the rooks, and possibly heading into an endgame where it was queen, bishop, bishop versus queen, bishop, knight. Which again, I know is technically supposed to be better for the side with the two bishops, but I would still have to prove that that I would have the advantage in that endgame, and wasn't totally confident just yet. So I was trying to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. At this point, I wanted to bring my a8 rook over to one of these files, so I played the move a6. At the time, I thought maybe white would take this time to infiltrate the diagonal on b6, clamping down on this d8 square, not allowing any of my rooks to get to the d-file, and possibly forcing me to have to trade off a pair of bishops in order to get access to the d-file or the c-file. But white decided not to go for that move at this time. They go rook to c1, which is totally a fine move. I thought more active would be to start to try to contest this d-file, and the computer does slightly agree here, but it doesn't really hate this move rook to c1. It is a open file at the end of the day, and if this knight moves, then white's rook's going to have some eyes. The tough part for white right now is that this light squared bishop is uncontested, and this pawn and bishop structure is very difficult for them to ever break down. As long as I don't allow for this knight to trade for this bishop, I should hold a slight advantage going into any sort of endgame. At this point, I kind of had a deep think here. I was trying to visualize how I wanted to go forward. Like I said, white's structure is still very solid here. Their bishop and queen are taking a lot of the diagonals away that I would like my bishop to get to. I felt like my bishop on e7 was very passive. I'm not trying to trade my bishop for their knight here on c3. And again, I felt that if I moved a rook over to the d-file, white would do the same, and with their knight defending the back rank, that we would maybe trade off at least a pair of rooks, if not both pairs of rooks, with each other. So I kind of went into the tank for a little bit, and then I remembered, well, we can send our h-pawn down the board, harry the h-pawn. Gives us an opportunity to create some luft for our king if we head into an endgame, so that there's no back rank checkmates ideas. We pick the light square next to our king because white also has a dark squared bishop, so we'll always have this square available to us, as white will not have a bishop to take away that square. So we end up launching h4, h5. My idea is we're trying to dislodge white's queen here, make him feel uncomfortable, and we have support to keep pushing the pawn at least one step further. And then I kind of had some visualization ideas of maybe in the future I'd be able to bring a rook to the d file, maybe a bishop to d7, and eventually if white decided to try to defend like this, where I go h4 and they slide the queen over, maybe I can bother the queen here with a bishop maneuver later on in the game. We did not end up getting that move. I was kind of quite surprised to see the move f3. I thought even h3 here would have been fine, as it's a little bit safer. Once f3 gets played, my eyes are lighting up to try to take advantage of this diagonal. This bishop now just lost its defender as well. So I was thinking, oh, if we can somehow get a queen to attack it, maybe we're able to get some ideas of attacking along these dark squared weaknesses that white's going to have here now that their pawn is on f3. So we continue with the plan to push h4 to dislodge black's queen. They end up going forward again. I was like, feeling fairly okay with this, especially now that f3 was played. If we ever get into the opportunity to sack this pawn here on h3 and have white's pawn from the g file get dragged over, this pawn would be a super liability later on in the game. Maybe we can tear some files open against white's king, but that did not end up happening here. I start to contest the d file, bring in a rook over. Again, I'd like to either infiltrate the rook to d3, maybe stack the rooks here. Again, maybe bring the bishop back down to d7, force white's queen to go elsewhere, and then push g3 or h3. And if white ever pushes again here, like again, this square would be weak. If we get an idea like this, well now if we ever get a queen to g3, that's checkmate. So we're just trying to make subtle jabs at white's position here. White ends up playing b3. They want to move their knight. After talking with her at the end of the game, I thought b3 and this queen a4 move were some of the slight weaknesses that were played throughout the game that allowed me to get this incremental advantage. After b3, all of a sudden we have two pieces that don't have any sort of defenders. White did want to move their knight, and they didn't want to drop the b2 pawn, which I totally understand. Maybe a better idea was to bring the rooks over to the c file and contest that way. Or again, yeah, I mean, maybe it is like this, where we can keep the rooks, this pawn back on b2 and stack the rooks here on the c file. Not 100% sure, but it did allow for my rook to infiltrate on d3, and white takes this opportunity to dive into e4. Strong move where I thought when I originally did the calculations that I was going to be winning a piece here, but obviously that's not the case. White has this idea of obviously taking the queen on f6 with check, and I even had thoughts of would it be worth it to sack the queen at all. At the end, not worth it. Technically it is playable and it is an even position where you're going to have the two bishops for two minor pieces and a pawn. We'd probably be able to get control of this d file, but there seemed like no reason to go into that sort of endgame. I just kind of felt bad here to take the knight, which is what I end up doing. The computer doesn't like that move. Originally, I was thinking that maybe white would have some opportunities to dive into f6, even for some sacrifices, but the computer just wants us to either offer a queen trade for white or slide our queen to one of these dark squares. Again, we have ideas of having our queen along the second rank here and applying a lot of pressure to these pawns. Instead, I do end up taking the knight on e4, and at this point I thought white was going to take back with the queen. It's defending their bishop here on e3, and just going into an endgame that I'm up one pawn, but as you can see, they've gotten some of that advantage that I had back. This rook is a little bit out in the middle of nowhere. If they take this pawn here, my b7 pawn is a little bit weak. My rook is weak. I would maybe have to bring my rook all the way back to d7 to defend, wasting a move, and not really giving me any sort of advantage moving forward here. Instead, white plays this tricky move. At the time, f takes e4. And at first I thought this was not a good move at all, but there's so many tricky options now that white has with this rook opened up on the f file. And it's actually a lot more dangerous than you first think. At first you think, we still have a bishop that's hanging. We have an isolated pawn now for white. But the opportunity now to sack on f7 and put pressure here on our queen on f6 is actually a lot to deal with. And, we can see opportunities of white stacking their rooks, and all of a sudden all of our defenders along the king side have vanished, and white's going to have a lot of major pieces. I mean, they even have ideas of bringing this bishop over to h6 and putting a ton of pressure on our king here, and without careful defense, it could have turned ugly as we went into the late game. Here, I dive into b2, putting pressure on these pawns over here. Remember, we are up a pawn on the black side, and as long as we can withstand the pressure that white's going to bring on our king, I thought if we could eat up a couple pawns, then we're going to have a pawn duo, at the very least, headed down the board to hopefully make a queen. I also felt it was fairly important to keep the queen along this dark square diagonal, as I thought maybe white would have some ideas of putting a lot of pressure here on the g6 pawn. Instead, we did not get that in the game, so after I played queen to b2, white offers a dark squared bishop trade. So I was doing a lot more calculations with bishop to h6. There's even some ideas of rook sacking on f7, and we'll actually see that later on in the game. It doesn't get played, but the one opportunity that white did have to save the game was with this crazy sack on f7. And at this point, I do end up trading away the dark squared bishop. In my eyes, I saw the queen coming back to d4, which is what I played. Now that we have access to this diagonal, white's queen is not hitting any of our pawns down here, and I thought that we'd be able to pick up this pawn here without any issue. After king moves, we take on e4, and at the time I was feeling fairly good. I'm defending this pawn. We just went up 2 pawns versus white, and I thought, okay, we're going to be able to get our other rook into the game. We might get our queen chased around a little bit, but we can either try to trade queens, or we can bring it over to the queen side here and maybe fight for some pawns. And we would head into the endgame, at the very least, up 1 pawn. Again, we're up 2 pawns right now, so if we could hold on to a 2-pawn advantage, then I was feeling confident that we could close out the game here. And at this moment, white has a crazy sack here on f7. And like I said, I was kind of calculating it when white still had their bishop on the board, and I didn't really look at it after the bishops were traded off, as I thought that this just wasn't going to be that big of a problem. But as you can see, we're forced to defend this pawn on g7. White is they're threatening checkmate, and if we end up taking the pawn here, it's actually checkmate in 4 for white. If we end up taking the rook here, it's checkmate in 4 for white, where their rook infiltrates, we have to go to the back rank. If we go here, well, that's mate in 1. If we go here, white takes, and that's mate in 2. And if we go to E8, that is mate in 1. So a super dangerous move, and especially now that our queen isn't eyeing the C7 square. So that rook that came over to C1 was actually playing a dangerous role as we got later into the game here. And this would have been a wild move to see over the board personally. We're forced to defend the G7 pawn here with queen over to D4. And then at this point, white's going to try to infiltrate, maybe triple up. Well, they can't triple up because we're threatening checkmate. And right now we're not able to play checkmate because white can defend with rook to F1. So if we try to dive in here, then white can just trade rooks there. And it gets even more, we're getting a little bit complicated here. We've only up a pawn, but white's pieces are putting a ton of pressure here on our black king. But unfortunately, my opponent did, or I should say fortunately for myself, my opponent didn't see this move and instead played bishop or rook to F4, trying to win back the pawn. Seems like a pretty natural move. And we want to keep our queen either on the attack here. Black or white has a lot of back rank threats at the moment if they're not too careful. Or we want to keep our queen where it can help defend along the king side here. I went with the counterattack, playing queen to E2 with the idea of rook to D1 checkmate, or I should say check, take, mate. And now this move does not work. I should say it does work. They have to. They're forced to bring their rook back if they're not too careful. And at this point, my opponent did end up blundering and took the pawn on H4. And after rook to D1, my opponent did resign. It was a great game overall. Like I said, if you were following along with the computer evaluation, it was given -2 or -3 for most of the game, but we were really only up a pawn and had the bishop pair, and it wasn't really super straightforward in my eyes of how to keep the game going. We were trying to chip away at white's defenses, this H4, H5, H5, H4 push, trying to dislodge the queen, and we were just really trying to take advantage of some subtle positional mistakes from our opponent. She played wonderful. She was really nice to meet her. I'm sure we'll be playing more games in the future as I go back there. Anybody in the South Florida area, highly recommend the Knights of South Florida chess meetup on Wednesdays. Wonderful group of guys and girls, and wide range of strong to intermediate players. I think there was only one unrated player there at the time, and then the ceiling or the floor was kind of 1,200 to a 2,200 level player. So a lot of good chess talent here in South Florida. I'm excited to be bringing more games to you guys in the future here. And thank you guys for watching this video. Have a good one.